But in the sacrifice actually carried out, consciousness, having nullified the action as its own doing, has also in principle obtained relief from its misery. That this relief has been obtained in principle is, however, the action of the other extreme of the syllogism, which is the essence possessed of intrinsic being. But the sacrifice made by the unessential extreme was at the same time not a one-sided action, but contained within itself the action of the other. For the surrender of one's will is only from one aspect negative. In principle, however, or in itself, it is at the same time positive. That is, the positing of will as the will of an other, and specifically of will not as a particular, but as a universal will. This positive meaning of the negatively posited particular will is taken by this consciousness to be the will of the other extreme, the will which, precisely because it is an other for consciousness, becomes actual for it, not through the unhappy consciousness itself, but through a third, the mediator as counselor. Hence, for consciousness, its will does indeed become universal and essential will, but consciousness itself does not take itself to be this essential will. The surrender of its own will as a particular will is not taken by it to be in principle the positive aspect of universal will. Similarly, its giving up of possessions and enjoyment has only the same negative meaning, and the universal which thereby comes to be for it is not regarded as its own doing. This unity of objectivity and being for self which lies in the notion of action, and which therefore becomes for consciousness essence and object, this unity is not the principle of its action. And so too it does not become an object for consciousness, directly and through itself. Rather, it lets the mediating minister express this certainty, a certainty which is itself still incomplete. That its misery is only in principle the reverse, that is, that its action brings it only in principle the self-satisfaction or blessed enjoyment, that its pitiable action too is only in principle the reverse, that is an absolute action, that in principle action is only really action when it is the action of a particular individual. But for itself, action and its own actual doing remain pitiable, its enjoyment remains pain, and the overcoming of these in a positive sense remains a beyond. But in this object, in which it finds that its own action and being as being that of this particular consciousness are being and action in themselves, there has arisen for consciousness the idea of reason, of the certainty that in its particular individuality, it has being absolutely in itself, or is all reality. We have finally arrived at paragraph 230, the last paragraph of this entire section of the unhappy consciousness, of the Stoicism, Skepticism of the unhappy consciousness, and of the self-consciousness section in general. So we're passing a very important milestone. This is again, like all the previous last paragraphs have been, a moment of transition where we're going to move into the very beginning of a new dialectic of reason. This one's going to be pretty vast. A lot more to say about that in a bit. And Hegel ends it on a very long passage, which we won't be able to all fit on the board at this point. I'll have to do a little bit of erasure and putting some other stuff up. But let's plow our way through it. So he says that, again, now what we've got is a sort of two-sided thing with the individual unhappy consciousness on this side and both the mediator and the unchangeable on this side as the essential as opposed to the unessential, a sacrifice, and Opferung, Opfer means sacrifice, and so there's an offering onto is taking place, and it's not just an offering of something extrinsic, it's an offering of the very being, the very activities, the very functions of the individual consciousness. So something really important is taking place here, something transformative. He goes on and then he says, in the sacrifice carried out, consciousness, having nullified the action as its own doing, has also in principle, and that in principle here is an sich. The reason that I put it there, that I put the German there, is because there's another an sich that shows up very soon that's being translated a little bit differently in this Miller translation, and I want to call your attention to it. So, in principle, the individual consciousness has obtained relief from its misery. It's no longer the unhappy consciousness an sich, in itself, but is it yet in and for itself? Not yet. That still has to be worked out. So there's you might say, a realization that has taken place that isn't fully actualized. That still has to be drawn out. And he goes on and he says that this relief has been obtained in principle is, however, the action of the other extreme of the syllogism, of the Schluss, right? The other extreme is the unchangeable. So it's still being viewed as the action of the other. And we're going to see that happen in two modalities here. He says, is the essence possessed of intrinsic being, an sich seiende, right? So, in a certain sense, the in itself isn't entirely on the side of the individual consciousness. It's still a little bit mistaken about the priority of what's going on. And he goes on and he says, the sacrifice made by the unessential extreme was at the same time not a one-sided action. There is a kind of reciprocal movement going on back and forth here. So how does this work? Hegel is going to talk in terms of two things at this point, in terms of will and in terms of enjoyment, and that's going to lead us to action. Actually, action involves both of these things. So he says this not one-sided action contained within itself the action of the other. And at first it looks like the action or the initiative on the side of the other predates, you might say, whether temporally or logically, what's happening on this side. But really, it's this side, the individual, who is making all of this happen, where the agency is really occurring. He says the surrender of one's will is only in one aspect negative. So surrendering one's will at first seems to be like giving something up, right? But as we've seen, there is a willing involved in the very surrender of one's will. The fact that one can give it over is a choice that stems from will. So it's not as if the will is totally, stripped away from somebody. They are carrying out that willing in giving it over. So here he talks in slightly different terms. He says that it's in principle, however, or in itself, right, an sich again, it is at the same time positive. How? Well, it's the positing of will as the will of an other. So it's positing, it's setting forth, it's putting out there, you could say, this whole idea of will. It's not just that it's retaining for itself a little bit of willing. It is actually making it possible for what its will is being surrendered to be a destination for its will, another will. When you surrender your will, you don't just surrender it out there, to the universe, to the cosmos. No, you surrender it to something else that has a will. If you're going to give over your own, autonomy of making judgments for yourself to a mediator, you're doing that precisely because that mediator, himself or herself, is assumed to be able to make judgments, right? So what happens here is there's a positing of will as universal. This is something that we're going to play out quite a bit in the reason section and also in the spirit section to come. But we're seeing just the very beginnings of it right here. And I'm smiling because this is something really interesting that's happening, and I know what's coming up down the line. So he says, it's the positing of will as the will of an other, and specifically a will not as a particular, not as just my will or that's will, but as universal will, as carrying a kind of rightness or normativity to it. It only makes sense to give your will over to the mediator as a rational being if you think that the mediator has actually got things better. if the mediator has a closer relationship than you do with what is unchangeable, what is essential, what has intrinsic being. When you're doing that, you're treating the mediator as if the mediator is the expression of a universal will. So he says, here we go, this positive meaning of the negatively posited particular will, the negatively posited particular will is one's own will, is taken by this consciousness to be the will of the other extreme. The will which, precisely because it is another for consciousness, becomes actual for it, not through the unhappy consciousness itself, but through a third, the mediator. It's hard to, wrap one's head around the will of the divine or something like that. It's easier to do so in terms of the will of something that is a mediator that you can actually, connect with. So he says, for consciousness, its will does indeed become universal and essential will, but consciousness itself does not take itself to be this essential will. Why? Well, consciousness has, as we've seen over and over again, failed to grasp that all of this is itself. All of this is consciousness, right? And it's treated consciousness as if it's just its own individual, contingent, unessential, almost next to nothing existence, bare existence. But that's really a mistake that it has to make, and in doing so and working through it, it comes to know itself as being involved in this entire process. We can go on a little bit further, and another similar sort of dynamic takes place. He says, the surrender, okay, here we go. The giving up of possessions and enjoyment has only the same negative meaning, and the universal, which thereby comes to be for it, so there's a universal generated in this as well, the universal is not taken to be its own being. Why not? What would the universal be in this case? We might think of the totality of enjoyment and possessions, right? That the individual only has a little bit of, and they can contribute to. They enjoy a little bit, but really, again, all of this is consciousness. There's a positing that's taking place there. There's a doing that is understood to be on the part of the other, on the part of the unchangeable, on the part of the mediator, on the part of that which really matters, as opposed to oneself that doesn't really matter, doesn't really have being, doesn't really have a meaningful, important existence. And yet, this is where the action is happening. Now, action is a very important term that's coming up here, and we need to erase a little bit of this and take up the rest of the paragraph once we've filled out the board a bit more. All right, so I've cleared us a bit of room for the rest of what Hegel's talking about here. I'm going to have to put a little bit more on the board as we go through this. But let's take up now at this idea, or as he's saying here, the notion, the Begriff, the concept of action. And why is Hegel focusing at the end of this section on action rather than on, say, thinking or cognition? Well, because for Hegel, action is going to be one of the central categories. This often gets left out when people are talking about the dialectic and the process. It tends to become very intellectualized, right? And Hegel is saying, no, where things really do happen is where ideas become action, where they become effective, wirklich, right? They become something that's actual, something that does things within the world, within a person's life, within consciousness itself. And so, thinking itself is an action. It's not the case that action is merely the after effect of thought. So he goes on, and I've got here in the center not only the mediator, but all this stuff that he's saying about the notion of action. he says that what happens is, we're going back to this giving up of possessions and the will. He says, this unity of objectivity and being for self, right? Gegenständlichkeit, being objective, being in the form of objects, and being for self, having a kind of reflexive relation to the self, being able to figure to the self. That is in the concept, the living unity of what action involves. There's a side of determining oneself involved in acting, and being able to take a stance upon oneself, form ideas about where one is going, turn oneself in the direction that one wishes, and also one treats oneself as an object. It's not just a matter of acting upon other objects, it's also using one's own faculties, one's own body, one's own resources as the object, right? So that's one side of it. And he says that, here we go, this unity of objectivity and being for itself, which lies in the notion of action, and which therefore becomes for consciousness, essence, Wesen, and object, Gegenstand, right? For consciousness, the question is going to be, well, where is consciousness in this? Is it over here? Is it over here? Is it over here? Is it through the entire thing? As we know very well it is. So it becomes therefore for consciousness, essence, and object. He says this unity is not the principle of its action. Whose action? The particular individual. This is what action, you might say, ought to be. Instead, for the particular individual at this stage, it's still, as he's going to call it, impoverished, ärmliche action, right? Pitiable is a nice translation. Something that is not fully what it ought to be. So he says, it's not the principle of its action, and so it too does not become an object for consciousness directly and through itself. Why not? Well, because its action was in part to sacrifice so many things to the mediator, to the essential, to whatever lay beyond, and even in thanking, there was that sacrifice taking place, right? Is that really going to be the case, though? Well, here's where we see something really quite striking occurring. He says, okay, the particular individual lets the mediating minister express this certainty. I put a certainty in with a question mark after it, because Hegel is going to call that certainty into question. From the perspective of the particular individual, the grass is greener on the other side, ontologically, or in terms of action, right? The mediator is the one who's really got this all together and is able to act in such a way that this is really the case. But he says, it lets the mediating minister express this certainty, a certainty which is itself incomplete. A certainty of what? That its misery, its unhappiness, its Unglück, right? The unhappy consciousness is unhappy, is only in principle, an sich, the reverse. That its action brings it only in principle self-satisfaction or blessed enjoyment. So the question here is not only of certainty being called into question, but also satisfaction. Where is satisfaction occurring? Who is enjoying satisfaction? Things are being exchanged. Consciousness, in the form of the particular individual, is divesting itself. It is actually acting an awful lot. It's doing a lot on its side in a lot of different modes, as we've seen, in terms of its willing, its desiring, in terms of its action itself, its work, its labor, in terms of its enjoyment or consumption, in terms of giving thanks. All the agency seems to be coming from the side of the particular individual. And yet, where is the satisfaction? Where is the enjoyment really taking place? Is it the universal unchangeable that's engaging in that, as we've seen projected so many times now throughout the course of this? Or do we have to ascend to a higher dialectical level? He goes on and he says, its pitiable action, its ärmliche tun, right, is only in principle, the reverse. That is, what? An absolute action. Absolute action would be happening on the side of the universal and the unchangeable. But here, Hegel is going to point out to us a little paradox or a problem with talking about absolute action and saying, oh, this is impoverished by comparison to it. What's the problem? Well, it's this. In principle, action is only really action when it is the action of a particular individual. Let me read that again. In principle, action is really only action when it is the action of a particular individual. This is all you get, ontologically. Whatever is happening over here is really happening because of this, or because of a sum of individual actions, or a composite, or some sort of effect of many, many individuals doing something, mediated through the mediator. But even the action of the mediator is ultimately, in some sense, coming from the particular individual. This is a reversal of perspectives that's taking place. The universal, the unchangeable, was seen as that which is providing everything. That's why you have to be grateful to it for giving you the faculties that you have. And yet, action really only occurs at the level of individuals. The idea, this sounds very anti-Hegelian, doesn't it? The idea in and of itself doesn't do anything. It just sits there. And where does it sit there? Maybe in a book. Maybe in somebody's head. Maybe as a little blurb, a bullet point in somebody's plan. It's only when particular individuals act that any of this really matters. So if this does seem to matter, and if this does seem to matter even more since it's the mediator, it's because of all these particular individuals who have indeed been acting. This is where idealism is really about the world of particulars, not just a mind out there thinking itself, but Hegel is trying to be as realistic as possible. So he goes on and he says, here we go. Action is really only action when it is the action of a particular individual, but the individual doesn't realize that yet. For itself, action and its own actual doing remain pitiable. Why? It hasn't yet grasped all of this. Its enjoyment remains pain. The overcoming of these in a positive sense remains a beyond. What is the beyond? What's happening over here? What's going on with the mediator that the particular individual doesn't yet grasp? What's happening with the thing that's being mediated, or the person, or whatever, the force that the mediator mediates? So he goes on. In this object, in which it finds that its own action and being as being of this particular consciousness are being and action in themselves. So we have being, and we have action of the particular individual, and then we have being and action in themselves. And these are all connected. These are all coming out of this. He says, there has arisen for consciousness the idea of reason, of the certainty that in its particular individuality, it has being absolutely in itself, or is all reality. Now, he is saying that this is very important here, idea of reason. He's not saying that this is the reality of fully developed reason, and he means something more than just, the rational faculty. He means rationality per se. But so far, what's coming onto the scene is not reason itself in its fully developed, deployed state. It's the beginning, the glimmerings of this. But the individual now has arrived at the point where the individual, at least the one who has advanced to this stage, can say, I get it. all of this is really for me. All of this is really an extension of what's going on for me through the social process in communication, however we want to make sense of it. It's not a purely solipsistic understanding because this is socially mediated. But each individual who is getting this can say, I have the potential to understand from the perspective not only of my particular being and my particular action, but of being an action in themselves. What I want to close with here is by stressing something that I mentioned a little bit earlier on, but I think is very important and is worth stressing over and over again. Hegel takes his position here not just in terms of being, not just in terms of thought, not just in terms of, theoretical philosophy, but in terms of action, in terms of doing, in terms of work, in terms of the things that human beings actually engage in because we have the faculties to do so. This is not a philosophy that is, detached from the world, although sometimes Hegel's been interpreted in such a way, right? And Hegel sometimes says things that give rise to that point of view. But here we see the Hegelian system in its greatest dynamic quality, in its focus on action. This is going to be very important as we go through the section to come, reason. It's not just speculative or theoretical reason that Hegel's going to be talking about us developing and charting that out. It's going to be practical reason, and practical reason is not going to be something totally cut off from or detached from, but you might say it actually undergirds theoretical reason. I'll leave you with that thought, and we've finally arrived at the end of this section.